They're fighting in the streets in Iran. What should we do about it, if anything, on this week's Uprising?
LibertyNation.com. They are the resistance, but we are the uprising. With Scott Cosenza and Tim Donner.
There's not going to be a President Donald Trump.
Hey, I'm president. Can you believe it?
I love the poorly educated.
The voters have guaranteed themselves slavery, economic disaster.
I can't believe I'm losing to this guy.
You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables.
Lordy, I hope there are tapes.
I have never met with Russians.
Putin is continuing to advance into Korea.
Black Lives Matter, the Antifa movement, is interested in preserving the fabric of America.
Welcome back to The Uprising, the podcast of LibertyNation.com. This is Scott Cosenza, and joining me today is Andrew Moran. And we're going to talk today about Iran and the situation there presently. And Andrew has written a provocative piece published on LibertyNation.com in which he... Well, I'll let you describe it in more detail, Andrew, but I will just say it's certainly anti-conventional wisdom and takes to task both the media and neocons, who I think you believe are sort of pounding the drums of war and unnecessarily so. So before you can correct me or inform people that I am correct with that layout of your position, let me just say that, so for people who don't know, the United States was involved in deposing the democratically elected leader of Iran in favor of placing the Shah of Iran into power. And Shah is basically, it was like another word for king, I guess, in terms of for lineage that was passed on by blood. The Shah was a brutal dictator. And it was the overthrowing of the Shah that brought in the Islamic regime under Jimmy Carter's watch, and what we've had until today. And that regime has been also somewhat brutal and repressive to those who speak out against it. And we saw massive street demonstrations starting last week in many cities in Iran that have seemingly to do with as much economic tension as sort of more basic liberty issues, and then also some pro-regime street demonstrations. And with that, I will give you the floor, Andrew, and you can tell me why I'm wrong, where I am wrong, and what your perspective is.
No, you're absolutely correct when you're listing the myriad of reasons of why people are protesting. Some people say it's the inflation rates in Iran, where the price of eggs has gone up 10 or 12%. Other people say they want freedom. But the general consensus among the media is that Iran wants freedom, and the U.S. must intervene somehow in order to give the Iranians that freedom. Bill Kristol was on MSNBC, I think either this morning or yesterday, and he was talking about how the world must help the Iranian people and ensure that they get their freedom from the Romanian government. And then there was actually a pushback from a fellow guest on that show who said that Bill Kristol has long advocated to use military force in Iran and actively kill Iranians in order to achieve the goal of what the neocons want, which is a U.S. presence in Iran. Lindsey Graham earlier this week, he said that there needs to be fatal blows to Iran. And all of this, it really harks back to both in 2009 and in the early 2000s. I remember when I was doing research on my article at LibertyNation.com, I came across this famous Bush speech, and he was talking about the whole premise was about Iraq. And he was saying that the U.S. must help provide a stable Iraq. I'll actually quote it. He says, the U.S. must implement a stable Iraq. And he kept saying that. And then in 2009, when the Green Revolution happened, there were all these neoconservatives who were coming out and saying Obama must use a military strike. He must take military action. There must be boots on the ground. And it's hard not to believe that somehow the U.S. is meddling in Iran's affairs right now, especially when the policy of Washington for the last few decades has been anti-Iran. Sure, there isn't much proof right now to suggest that CIA has been meddling in Iran, but considering its record in Tripoli and Damascus and Kiev since over the last 5 to 10 years, you just have to think there are some fingerprints, U.S. fingerprints on Iran right now.
I read an article after reading your piece, and it talked about how the Iranian regime is responsible for the most U.S. military deaths outside of Iraq and Afghanistan in recent history, with its development and implementation of the IEDs against our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yep. And I wonder if you think that now I know that we don't have a declared war against Iran, and that's problematic in terms of making acts of war against Iran. But if we can table that particular issue for a moment, do you think it's appropriate for the United States to use what would be considered outrageous means against a friendly regime in the country of Iran to foment regime change?
Well, the record of regime change has been pretty deadly. Look at Libya. They took out Muammar Gaddafi, and that region is completely destabilized. The taking out of Gaddafi helped ignite the migration crisis we're experiencing right now. Taking out Yushchenko in Ukraine has led to tensions in Eastern Europe. Taking out Saddam Hussein, when they first actually put him into power, created deadly results for United States soldiers and people in the region. And in terms of Iran sponsoring terrorism, the foreign policy experts are saying the exact same thing about North Korea right now. They're saying the exact same thing about Russia. If you want to avoid having Iran fund terrorism, there's one simple thing the U.S. can do. That's just leave the region, bring the troops home, concentrate on domestic issues. Don't put American lives in jeopardy for the sake of just nation building or having a neo-colonialism or having a modern day or a significant presence in Iran. Just have a non-interventionist foreign policy and trade, travel, and talk with the rest of the world, and stop trying to impose the American way of life on Iran. Right now, with the situation in Iran, let's say it is about peace and it is about freedom, and the Iranian people don't want to have theocracy anymore. If you want to give the protest legitimacy, don't interfere. When Donald Trump said recently that the U.S. will offer the protesters supplies or support in quote appropriate time, that undermines everything that they're trying to do. The Iranian people in 2009 actually didn't want the Obama administration to interfere and give them any type of support, because they knew that if the U.S. were to have lent some type of military or financial assistance to those protesters, then it would have completely undermined everything they were trying to do.
Let me just, if I may, stop you and interrupt with a question on the point about not even just U.S. material involvement, but for sort of this emotional support or rallying, if you will. One of the major, and I know that we wanted to talk a bit about our media's reaction to these stories. One of the stories that I saw going around quite a bit in response to the sort of mainstream media treatment of this current crisis in Iran was to say that it seemed like the former Obama officials and Clinton State Department officials were going out of their way to try to kind of advocate that the U.S. just basically stay silent on the current situation and let the Iranians sort it out. And by the way, as President Obama did, much to the dismay of a number of freedom advocates, I would say, in addition to probably neocons. And let me say that, I think that, just to lay the cards out on the table, like you, I believe, I have a lot of trouble with the neocons and think that often they're warmongers and do a great disservice to liberty and the U.S. interests around the world with their warmongering. But at the same time, I know that I've seen many accounts of dissidents from the former Soviet Union, from other oppressive states, that say that the moral authority that the U.S. can lend with a word from the president can be very powerful in their favor. And so I wonder, what do you make of all that?
Well, I find it interesting. As I wrote in my piece, I was talking about how the swamp suddenly worries about human rights. But every time, as history have shown, every time every time Washington officials and neoconservatives and the pundits talk about human rights, it often leads to some type of military intervention. And
lots of people dying, by the way, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's been the
lots of non-combatants dying as well. Right.
I'm sorry.
Lots of non-combatants dying.
Yeah, exactly,
well.
And that's terrifying. And as I've talked about for months now, how the leftists and neoconservatives have converged on foreign policy. You had recently Elizabeth Warren shrieking about human rights. You have Bill Kristol talking about human rights. You have Lindsey Graham talking about human rights. And there's actually a trinity going on on at least on social media between Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and John McCain. They all talked about how the U.S. is watching very closely and how the Iranian government remaining must respect and defend human rights. But if you pay attention to the media, it's hard. It's very rare to come across a story on network television about the pro-government demonstrations. There are tens of thousands of people coming out in support of Khomeini. I was watching this morning an interesting interview between Daniel McAdams and Ron Paul, and McAdams was talking about an Associated Press story. And the Associated Press used a pro-government demonstration photo to talk about anti-government demonstrations. It just shows how the media, they have a certain objective they have with covering their story, and they use the exact same lines again. They say, "Oh, well, this is completely different. This isn't going to lead any sort of blowback, or it's not going to lead to any unintended consequences, or it's going to be a peaceful transition for Khomeini to whoever else the Washington elite want to be in Iran."
Do you think that Iran is significantly different from Libya, from Egypt, from some of these other Arab Spring countries because of the, I don't know if the right word is the level of civilization, the level of modernization, the level of education? Do we run the same risk? In other words, so when Gaddafi was deposed and murdered in the street, the result has been a chaotic situation where it's basically a failed state, right? It's Mad Max in Libya. Do we run the same risk in Iran, or is it more of like a, I don't know. I guess the reason. Okay, so I'll get to the point. And I apologize for beating around about it. It seems to me like Iran is almost like a place held hostage. There are modern people there who are educated and sophisticated and have all the sort of infrastructure of a highly functioning state and society. Yet they seem to be, held hostage by the mullahs, from my perspective. And does that not present a different cause for potential liberation with our help than, for instance, Libya does?
But what would that help entail?
Well, one of the things I think it would entail is saying to the Iranian regime that what you're doing is unacceptable, as Trump has done, and I know that we've increased the sanctions against them, and also I think pulling back from a lot of the what seems to me to be disastrous deal that Obama struck with them, giving them oodles of cash for seemingly not much in return in the way of non-proliferation or aids to human rights. Am I wrong about that?
Okay, so two things. First, when you're talking about President Donald Trump condemning the Iranian government over the protest, or criticizing the government anyway.
Right.
What about the shoe? What about the shoe on the other foot? What if Iran were to say to Donald Trump, or any other country for that matter, were to say to the United States, what you're doing is wrong, you can't do this, we're going to provide support to your opponents to ensure that your government is undermined? Would that be justified? I'm pretty sure most Americans would hate for Russia, for China, or any other country to say to the administration, whether Democratic or Republican, that you can't do this, that you must follow a certain way of logic. Second part, sanctions. One of the reasons apparently for the Iranian protests are sanctions. Now, as we've learned from the past, the sanctions hurt the people far more than the government itself.
Mm-hmm.
So if the economy is tumbling in Iran, and it has been in recent years, the sanctions wouldn't help the Iranian people. In fact, I'm pretty sure the Iranian people, they would feel a lot of animosity towards the countries or the states or the organizations that are applying sanctions on the country. Because if you have sanctions, how the heck can you function in an economy? Same thing in North Korea right now. North Korea is being starved to death, but you know who's not being starved to death? Kim Jong-un. So the Iranian government, you can apply all the sanctions you want, but the oil is still being produced, which is benefits the Iranian government, and the food is going to go to the Iranian government, and anything else that you provide support to the Iranian government or provide support to Iran will actually go to the government. And one last thing too, with Syria, we had the rebels in the country, and the Clinton-led State Department said that the rebels, they're the moderate ones, they're the ones who are going to get rid of al-Assad, and they need the weapons, they need the supplies, they need any kind of support they need that you have to give them. Iran, let's hope that won't happen the same thing. But as part of recent Trump policy, he's not going to provide any support to rebels or any weaponry or any financial means. So hopefully, same thing in Syria won't happen in Iran.
Do you think that the efforts that the U.S. made during the Cold War to support dissidents in the Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union were things that we should have done, or does your non-interventionist mandate, is it across the board and absolute? Do you think that the best course for humans generally and for us as Americans in terms of how we exercise this foreign policy is to always be hands-off, or are there sometimes appropriate intervention points for us, consistent with the Constitution and our notions of liberty and all that good stuff?
Well, when it comes to non-aggression principle and non-interventionist foreign policy, there are only two justified forms of attacks. If your country is actually attacked or an attack is imminent, then all that is justified. Anything else is not justified. In terms of the Eastern Europe or the Soviet dissidents, if that were to happen today, they can come to the United States, come into the country, do whatever they want. But to actually go into foreign land and intervene somehow, that's not justified at all.
So for instance, let's say there was a program, and I know there have been, to distribute, for instance, movie cameras to North Korean dissidents so that they can document some of the abuses of the regime. Yeah. I just want to be clear that I'm differentiating. I'm not talking about like dropping bombs, okay, or withholding medicine, which I think they're very powerful arguments against. But the kind of activities like I just listed, which would certainly be against the interests of the regime, and they would perhaps be seen as hostile, but are not violent per se. Are you including those sorts of things as well in your prohibition on acting against regimes that haven't aggressed violently against the regime where we live?
Well, private organizations can do those things. I've documented, there's a fantastic organization in Canada called Envoys, and they provide assistance to North Korean refugees and those who flee the country. They also work with South Korean groups to provide those types of cell phones, to provide movies, to provide cameras, to provide any type of assistance to help showcase what is occurring in North Korea.
But you don't think it's appropriate. But you don't think it's appropriate for governments to do those things. Is that right?
No. I do not think the government should intervene in any regard whatsoever, unless the government has personally, or actually, if the country's been attacked, or if there's an imminent attack. Then no government should intervene in the matter. If it's the region itself can somehow work out the matter. So in case of Iran, that the regional governments can somehow come to a conclusion. Or in terms of North Korea, Japan can work out a conclusion. Russia can, South Korea. Those countries are responsible. But the United States, they're separated by an ocean.
Do you think that the French should not have intervened in the American Revolutionary War? Do you think that was an inappropriate foreign policy intervention that is inconsistent with the way nations should appropriately act towards their brother nations?
Can you go into more detail, please?
Well, we sought the assistance of the French to fight the English in our war for independence, and they gave it. Lafayette, the whole bunch of them, probably wouldn't have won the war without them, at least not the way we did and as timely as we did, to gain our independence from Great Britain and the King. And I wonder if you think that if you were alive at the time, you would have said, no, this is inconsistent with appropriate hands-off policy towards other nations' interests because they weren't attacked. Is that? I'm sort of trying to drill down and get. I mean, we're both libertarians, and I think we're both against wars, all these wars that we're in a constant state of war, and find that to be a horrible state of affairs. But I think I want to try to drill down to see exactly where the differences are, and I think that there are some differences, and I just want to sort of explore those with the limited time we have left, and see. You seem to be having an absolutist prohibition on meddling, or and I use that term. Acting in other states to advance the interests of either your own state or the perceived interests of the people who live in the state in which you're meddling in. And I seem to think that there are at least limited cases where it's appropriate. And so that's I asked the question in order to try to drill down on those differences.
Now, again, what about shooting the other foot? Would you support other countries intervening into the internal affairs of the United States?
I think that I have to try to err always on the side of liberty, and I'm while I am an American and I do have some sort of national pride, even though I think that that's probably perhaps intellectually indefensible in terms of tribalism. What I'm more concerned with is the human liberty and that people get to live free. And if, for instance, there was some sort of meddling that could have ended our drug war before it began, or removed the death penalty, or racist police officers, or Jim Crow. Yeah, I mean, it kind of feels icky when you think of other countries, meddling. But to the extent that it advances human liberty, and by the way, this all leaves aside the hubris of which, and I recognize that it is a great deal of hubris that we can somehow decide what is best for people and what's going to result in positive change. And I understand that we're not likely to really be able to determine that.
Okay. So the Bill of Rights are fundamental to the United States. Let's say the Trump administration or the next administration or the administration after that, let's say that they eliminated the Second Amendment or they suspended the First Amendment. Would you, or in today's case, the Fourth Amendment has been eroded? Is a foreign government justified in somehow meddling in those issues?
I think that if I were locked up in prison, in federal prison, so I published a piece on LibertyNation.com today about Trump's breaking his campaign promise on the drug war. And Jeff Sessions' action yesterday revoked what was called the Cole Amendment, which basically was a hands-off policy directing federal prosecutors to leave people in states where marijuana was legal at the state level alone and not prosecute them federally. So I took Donald Trump to task on that and Mr. Sessions. And I think if I were locked up in federal prison because of that, and China or Russia or North Korea or anybody genuinely tried to agitate for my freedom and rebuke the United States for imprisoning me in violation of a fundamental right, I would be grateful for that, even if they were a foreign actor. I really do.
But realistically, whatever happens is usually a physical conflict. Because if the neoconservatives were to say, Scott Cosenza, he's being jailed for exercising his First Amendment rights, first they would declare how sad they are for it, and then they would say, oh, there needs to be sanctions for it. And then, as we've learned from the past, every time the sanctions are applied, they usually lead to some sort of physical recourse, a violent recourse, and that would involve invasions or bombs to ensure that Scott Cosenza has his First Amendment or Second Amendment or Fourth Amendment rights.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, every country has its own set of values and every set of its core values and principles. I mean, we love our First Amendment, or apparently, conservatives and libertarians love their First Amendment rights. In Russia, First Amendment isn't as celebrated as it is in the United States. Canada too, there isn't a First Amendment right. So should the U.S. suddenly intervene in Moscow to demanding them have First Amendment rights for the media, or demanding that Canada stop prosecuting certain members of the press for having or politically incorrect feelings, or even when it comes to the gender identity, can be fined or imprisoned? Should the U.S. somehow provide some sort of support to conservatives or those who try and seek First Amendment rights?
Well, support is an interesting thing, and I think that, yes, they should. If support is a tweet or an announcement or a conference, or, Reagan was famous for, when he would visit a foreign country, he would visit the dissidents in that country that were pro-freedom, that kind of support, to give international press exposure to those people. So, in some sense, I think the answer is yes. To the extent that we should be exporting our own values at the tip of a spear, well, then, of course, I would say no.
See, that's fantastic. I've written about that too before, where you export American principles, you export American principles and values like free markets and freedom and free trade. That's how you do it. But you don't actually go out there and you start imposing sanctions and shutting down bombs and putting boots in the ground in foreign territories. You
lead by example.
I mean, the United States should never suspend the First Amendment. They shouldn't send millions of people to jail because they smoke pot. They shouldn't enter into egregious trade treaties and just impose free trade. That's how you lead by example. And that's how you encourage freedom from around the world. You don't have the military in 100 countries and 700 military bases all over the world to impose your way of life on those countries.
Okay, let me ask you, and we're running a bit long here, and I thank you for staying with us and for joining us today on this. I think it's an important topic. And finally, I just want to ask, you mentioned that the pro-regime demonstrators were out in force as well recently. Do you have a sense...
Oh, that's right, we're talking about Iran.
What's that?
Well, that's right. We're talking about
right. Do you have a sense, is the regime well supported internally? I had a sense previous to reading about the pro-regime counter-protests or protests that the regime was not well supported, that it was sort of, not well regarded by the general populace, especially the younger people who make up a large portion of that country. Can you give us your sense of that?
Rouhani, he was elected overwhelmingly as part of the Reform Party, or the Reformists. They wanted to change the way Iran was run, and they had a massive mandate for that. They had all sorts of people giving them their support, and I think they got around 60% in the 2017 election. So Rouhani was widely supported just a few months ago. That's why I'm very suspicious of these protests, because if you remember, I think it was last week, there was a report that National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster and the Israeli government, they came to some sort of eventually putting steps on the ground in Iran. And then there was another report recently about the executive order that Trump signed was if you're found to be violating human rights, then the U.S. can freeze your assets. So when these happen and then suddenly these massive protests occur, then I become quite concerned about the future. And I'm pretty sure that we are going to see reports in the future of intelligence meddling, or non-government organizations entering in Iran, or the CIA having some sort of fingerprints on Iran. So it's very hard to determine what exactly Iranian is perceived to be, because again, we really don't know why. We can't come down to the exact reason as to why the protests are occurring. Some say it's because egg prices have surged 10%. Some people say it's because they want more religious freedoms.
Well, you don't risk your life for 10% of the cost of an egg, right? So that's a little silly.
If that was the case, then Americans would be in uprising since 2000 because the cost of a carton of eggs has surged 106%.
Right. Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there, and we'll keep our eyes tuned to your reporting and analysis on the issue as well as others. For LibertyNation.com, this is Scott Cosenza and Andrew Moran. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
LibertyNation.com. They are the resistance, but we are the uprising. With Scott Cosenza and Tim Donner.
There's not going to be a President Donald Trump.
Hey, I'm president. Can you believe it?
I love the poorly educated.
The voters have guaranteed themselves slavery, economic disaster.
I can't believe I'm losing to this guy.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables.
Lordy, I hope there are tapes. I have never met with Russians.
Putin is continuing to advance into Korea.
Black Lives Matter, the Antifa movement is interested in preserving the fabric of America.